Putting it all together, we're going to talk about the approach of the development process, how to debug issues, and creating something that does something. That may seem obvious, but a lot of code, especially if you're going the classical education route, a lot of code is theoretical. One of the favorites is recursion. So write a recursive function, and you're writing a function that calls itself until, for whatever reason it stops. They're useful and they're fundamental, but they're not exactly exciting. And at the end of the day, they don't produce anything. They give you knowledge, but it's not something you can use afterwards except the concept and knowledge. So what I want to do here is create something that actually has value, that is actually usable, and that you can create and you can work with to make something bigger, better, and then you can kind of see your learning in action. The development approach, design and spec. There's a lot of different software development processes. There's agile, there's waterfall, there's SDLC, there's rapid application development, and all of these are great. And if you're working on a professional team, you're going to have these sort of professional frameworks that you're going to work with. And all of them have their pros and cons. But the reality is planning is important no matter what framework you use. And you really need to do that if you want to make a good piece of software. You're writing 20 lines of code. Do you need to plan it out? Probably not. You can just write it. If you planned it out, it might be 18 lines of code. It might run a little more efficiently. It might do a little more. But the reality is, at that point, planning isn't really that important. But there's a good rule that I've learned over time, which is for every 1 hour spent planning, you save 4 hours of work. Now, that doesn't mean that by having a 4-hour planning meeting, you're going to save 16 hours of work. You actually have to do the planning. You have to be actively doing that. By making decisions beforehand and by really thinking things through as to how are point A and point B going to work together, how do you get from point A to point D, you're really going to save yourself time in the long run, and it's just going to make everything easier. So even if you're not a planner, you like kind of just jumping in, thinking about what you're doing really is important. When it comes to planning, start small and high level. So if you want to develop a social media app, or you want to develop, in this case, we're developing a daily dashboard. So it's really, what are the functionality you want? Well, I wanted weather, I wanted a map, I wanted news, and I wanted Twitter. And those were my big things that I wanted on there. And that's where I started from. You also want to decide what your project does and what your project doesn't do. And that's the most important thing, is you can get lost in scope creep. As you're reading through documentation, you'll say, oh, I can do that. Oh, I can do that. Oh, I can do that. And all of a sudden, you're then focused on something that you never really wanted to do to begin with. And knowing what you want to do helps you focus. So if you know that all you want out of, Facebook is a share button, you can search for the Facebook share button documentation, find that, copy paste the example code, tweak it as necessary, and move on. Whereas if you're just like, hey, I want to integrate Facebook, you're then set with the daunting task of reading all of Facebook's documentation just to see what's interesting. And then at the end of the day, you might, well, I want that, and that. And in reality, you didn't need all that. And finally, draw diagrams. I am a very technical person. I love my technology. I love taking notes on a laptop. But I also go into nearly most meetings, especially planning meetings, without a computer. I go with just a notebook. I take notes, I draw, I scribble, I doodle. I'm not a very good doodler, but I do it nonetheless. There's a lot of value to doing that. And in fact, I even made a doodle for this. This is what I made. This is what I wanted it to look like. So over here, I have my weather panel. I had a map panel. I wrote a note. It was like, okay, right click, and then, you have a modal. It'll save your location. Let's use cookies to save your location. Then I had your calendar snapshot, your Twitter feed. I had an idea for some action bar over here with some share this, and I have tweet, Facebook share, ad. So this isn't complicated. But by drawing this out, I could look at it and say, okay, how would I move things around? Because while there are visual code editors, and you could use those to do this as well, I find that it's so much easier to just cross this out, draw it again, and mark it up, and just sometimes just looking at things from a different perspective will give you a lot more value. And the last little aspect and some tips I can give you is chunk your development and do things one feature at a time. So if we go back here, so it's like, all right, how do I approach starting this? I could lay out every single item on here, and I was like, no, weather. Let's just get the weather app going. So I got my little weather panel going and I wrote that code. And then it's like, okay, get the map. So I got the map going. Then it was like, okay, now I wanted the map to integrate with the weather to be able to choose your zip code. So I then worked on the interactivity between the weather and the map. Then I got the calendar. Calendar was easy. It was just a copy, paste, embed, but boom, it's there. The Twitter feed, okay, I got the Twitter feed in there. Now to load the Twitter feed, I needed to be able to set your Twitter feed. So I had to add the Twitter feed button. So one at a time, I prioritized what content I wanted in, and I focused on that until I was done with that functionality. And that meant that instead of one giant project that was difficult to do, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it was roughly 6 smaller projects that I could focus on one at a time. And that made it a lot more palatable and made it a lot easier. It also felt like a win. When I finished weather, it was like, hey, I finished weather, as opposed to, oh my God, I have so much else to do. Look things up early. I've been developing in JavaScript for 15 years. Been a software developer for 20 years. The web app that I just created took about 4 hours to create. So just to put things in perspective when we go through it, it took me about 4 hours to make. On top of this, I looked up maybe 5 or 6 things about core JavaScript while doing it. I wanted to make sure that I was using a function in the right way. I think it was even parse float. I just wanted to make sure that I was, using it in the right way. There was a few other little functions or errors that I had to look up, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're not expected as a developer to know everything. When you're in school, you have to take a test and everything has to be memorized. But when you're in the workplace, you have the internet. And what's more important is that you can write the code and not necessarily that you remember the code, or at least not that you remember how every function works. So if you're struggling, or if you're just thinking like, oh man, how do I do that? You don't need to give yourself a half hour to get the right answer. Just immediately search. Just look it up in the documentation. And especially with the APIs, because some of these APIs I have never worked with before this video. So I had to have them all open, and I was constantly looking through them. So I would say out of that 4 hours of development time, 2 hours of that was looking up API documentation and debugging. So trying to do something, realizing that it didn't work the way I wanted to, or something was confusing, and then having to do it over again. Ask for help. If you are developing alone, find a programming buddy. Find someone via Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, to work the way I wanted to with questions. Because sometimes when you're searching for documentation, if you want to know how a function works, then don't poke your friend. Poke documentation. But if you're just trying to work through something, so let's say you have 5 lines of code that it seems logical, but it's not doing what you want it to. Just paste it and say, hey, look, I'm trying to do X, but Y is happening. Can you help me? And sometimes a second pair of eyes is just necessary and will save you hours of debugging. And the same goes in reverse. Be a friend for somebody. If you know someone who's just learning how to code, be like, hey, look, ask me your questions. And the last one is it's okay to go back to designing. As you're developing, if you hit a wall and you realize, man, I really can't do something that I wanted to do, well, it's okay to go back to your design phase and say, all right, do I really want to do this? Or is there something else? Or what really is the functionality I want? And how can I achieve that?